Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within the reach of a small elite. I first want to quote something from EconLib, which says that 17% of professors in the social sciences self-identify as Marxists. According to The Independent, more than a third of millennials approve of communism and the collective means of ownership. This same poll also found that 70% of millennials are likely to vote socialist. So in today's discussion, I want you to know that I'm not just attacking straw man. This is genuinely a large issue in society. Joining me to discuss this is the author of Race Marxism, Dr. James Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay, thank you so much for your time. What is race Marxism?
Critical race theory. Just to put kind of a blunt answer. The truth is that critical race theory reproduces Marx's theory. It's basically a repackaging, in fact, of the Communist Manifesto, which I was just rereading last night, as a matter of fact. It's a repackaging of the Communist Manifesto that centers race instead of class. It makes race, as critical race theorist named Gloria Ladson-Billings put it, it makes race the central construct for understanding inequality. So issues of class, along with issues of culture, society, et cetera, all have to be understood through the lens of race and racism. But it's a direct repackaging of Marxist theories about how class antagonism works in the context of race antagonism instead. So it's, in a sense, a backdoor to communism, though communism is now being understood in a broader context, not merely economic, but also social and cultural. Capital or privilege are being incorporated into the analysis as well.
I want to quote from Marx's manifesto. He says, in the bourgeoisie and proletarian section, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried out on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Please translate that class Marxism into race Marxism.
Yeah, it's really simple. The exactly what he just said, whether it's, the producer versus the manager, whether it's the journeyman versus the apprentice, and he says, oppressor versus oppressed. What you have is a reproduction of this exact mentality where the class division is people who have, and I'm going to phrase this carefully, people who have access to whiteness and people who do not. In particular, they go by the moniker people of color. And it's a little complicated because some people of color are said to have access to whiteness. For example, Dave Chappelle recently told jokes at the expense of trans people, and they were pretty funny. And so that was, his thing to do. And the article that came out criticizing him for this said that he has access to white privilege, and said, in fact, conflating class and whiteness, saying that him being rich and having what you might call FU money in the kind of common parlance translates to him having access to white privilege. So people who have access to whiteness, or to the kind of the upper strata of society, if you were to put it into a simple antagonistic class stratification system, people who have access to the upper class of society, they get special privileges, special treatment, etc., have access to whiteness, and then they are oppressing by their very continued existence and the relationship that exists between them and the so-called racial underclass, what we would say is a people of color. So it's everything that he just said, the oppressor versus oppressed, just translate that into a racial dynamic that's centered in whether or not you have access to this thing called whiteness, becomes the dynamic by which society is characterized for the critical race theorists, the race Marxists. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but whiteness is deemed in critical race theory as a form of property that's actually considered a pillar of critical race theory thought. that whiteness is a form of private property that is, you can exclude people from, in particular, among all the other properties of property. And you didn't read this part from the manifesto, but in the second chapter, Marx says that the communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property, which he elaborates and says, by this we actually mean bourgeois private property. Whiteness is to be understood as bourgeois private property. So people who have access to whiteness are the upper class, who are antagonizing or exploiting the racial lower class. And again, it's just a complete critical race theory, if you study the subject itself, is a complete and perfect reproduction of this mentality, putting race in place of class.
Can you explain how, well, the first example he gives is, in the history of class struggles, is freeman and slave. Well, what he does here immediately is takes freeman and slave, one person benefiting at the expense of another through initiating violence against them. And then today that's gone to white versus black, which means that someone in this oppressor category could have done literally nothing as a causal result of turning them into an enemy class. How has this philosophy gone from oppressor versus oppressed to as a result of your actions versus oppressor versus oppressed as a result of accident of birth?
Okay, so yeah, you have to understand that for Marx, the classes, what happens, with slavery versus the freedman, for example, is that this begins as a consequence of actions, but becomes a system. It becomes an institution. In fact, the Southerners before the Civil War gave the euphemism for slavery as a peculiar institution. So it becomes an institution. It becomes a societal program. So the way that Marx viewed this was that you have the people who are actually doing the productive work at the bottom. So the slaves are being farmers. They're building things. They're swinging the hammer and the sickle, if you will. They're doing the productive work. They're putting the food actually on the table. And then you have, say, their slave masters or their bosses that pay their wages or whatever it happens to be, whichever stage of history you're in, and that those people are exploiting them for their labor so that they don't have to do physical labor. They can do other things. And Marx says that this is very artificial. So the people who do the production, he called the infrastructure or the base of society. And the people who manage them are the superstructure of society. And what he actually says is that those two exist in a dialectical material relationship, right? They're antagonistic to one another. That's the class antagonism. And what that produces, that difference, rather than being seen as equals who interact together as equals, they're now in an antagonistic oppressor versus oppressed relationship. He says this creates what he called social relations. And those social relations actually become self-perpetuating. The people who benefit from them want to keep them in place, and in fact want to deny that they're engaged in anything oppressive, that they're complicit in this oppressive institution. So it may start, something with slavery may start with actions and turn into an institution, and then it just turns into a general structure of society, an organizing principle of society. And then that thing becomes self-perpetuating, according to the theory. And the idea is that the people who benefit from it will reproduce it. They won't realize they're reproducing it, and they'll try to rationalize that they're reproducing it. And the set of rationalizations and their justifications for why they get to be on top while other people are on bottom are what Marx called ideology. And so within critical race theory, you see this exact mentality. You had people who decided to enslave people based on race. They created an institution out of it. So the action-based racism, which would say be taking a slave, becomes an institution-based racism, institutional racism, that eventually through time actually becomes a social assumption. So it becomes part of the social structure or the system that we operate in. And so racism takes on a different form from individual to institutional to structural and systemic over time. And it's a product of this idea of the social relations. And then again, the people who benefit from this perpetuate it kind of endlessly because they benefit from it, and they want to deny their participation in it and their complicity in it. And the name here for the ideology for Marx was capitalism, the idea that you should be able to use your capital as you wish. That's I've earned my capital. I should do what I wish with my capital. That's capitalism. It is a ideology based on the idea that capital is kind of primary and good and a part of your private property. In critical race theory, the primary ideology is white supremacy, that white people have an intrinsic access to this whiteness, and they have intrinsic benefit in society, and that they don't have to be racialized, et cetera, all the different things that they say. So that's where it shifted into an accident of birth. In particular, when it shifted, it was an accident of birth for Marx if you were born into the working class versus whether you were born into the aristocracy, if you will, or the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, because usually through nepotism or whatever, as he would have it, the children of the bosses became the next bosses. They went to the best schools. The whole system is set up for their benefit. So individual action becomes systemic again. And then within race, it was that white people justified why they were colonizing, why they were enslaving, and why they get to own a higher status in society. And then that justification became kind of a self-perpetuating thing that changed forms from white people from Europe are intrinsically better, say in the 1700s, superior individuals, to we worked harder for our position and it's just how things are and you have to deal with it, kind of later to this kind of full-blown I worked from my position. I went to the right schools. I sacrificed, et cetera. Meritocracy based view, kind of here at the end of the thing. But for them, this is all a continuous evolution of the set of excuses of the ideology of white supremacy, for why people who have access to whiteness get to have special privileges in society that everybody else is excluded from.
There was a book by Joseph Stalin titled Dialectical and Historical Materialism, where he says, or to put it more crudely, whatever is man's manner of life, such is his manner of thought. This means that the history of development of society is above all the history of the development of production, the history of the models of production which succeed each other in the course of centuries, the history of the development of the productive forces and of people's relations to productions, what he calls class consciousness. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So what he's actually talking about is this is really that. I mean, that's very kind of Stalin. It's a couple steps removed from Marx, but this is very pure Marxist thought. And so for him, for Marx and would be Lenin and Stalin as well, all of history is the history of the relationships made by the different relationships around the means of production. Okay, so how are we going to produce for society? How are we going to get enough food? How are we going to build shelter? How are we going to do whatever? These are the different aspects of production. And then you look at the different means of production, and it's again, we keep coming back. We can come back to the hammer and sickle again and again, because the hammer and sickle are emblems of productive work, of the worker and of the farmer. And that's where the Marxists in the 19th century and early 20th century believed that the real labor was being done. The builders and the farmers were the ones who are really making the stuff that makes society work. If you don't have a house, if you don't have steel and concrete, you can't build, a brutalist dormitory or whatever posing as an apartment building. If you don't have farmers growing the grain, you don't have anything to eat. And so everything else is this kind of fake thing on top of it. It's all fake managerial stuff on top of it that isn't and shouldn't be necessary. If everybody just got along and everybody did their share of productive work and then shared the fruits of their labor, everything could be kind of perfect. That's the vision of communism. And so what happens is that the means of production, how you figure out who's going to build the house, who's going to build the dormitory, who's going to harvest the grain, who's going to work in the field, who's going to do this, how are we going to do it, what are the means, what mechanism, is it going to be a hammer, is it going to be a sickle, is it going to be a combine, is it going to be some big piece of machinery, is it going to be some industrial thing, what is it going to do? All of that starts to shape who human beings are. So what he starts out saying there is that who men are is shaped by their relationship to the means of production. What he's talking about is a doctrine within communism. It's called material determinism. That the material conditions in which you exist determine your character, determine your values, determine how you see the world, determine how everything you encounter in the world is how you experience it. And so if you're in the proletariat, for example, if you're in the working class, you live in a set of conditions of exploitation and hard work and danger and risk and alienation from your product, alienation from your fellow man who you're now forced to compete with for limited amounts of wages or limited amounts of profits or whatever it happens to be in the system. And if you're born into the bourgeoisie, you are born into a situation of privilege where you have this whole ideological kind of mythology around you telling you why you get to be special, why you get to be an elite in society, why you don't have to do productive work, why that's, we used to say to young people, you go to college so you can get a good job, right? What does that mean? So you can get a white collar job and not have to do blue collar labor, not have to do productive work in the kind of Marxist thing. And so the conditions in which you exist within society, according to this doctrine that Stalin's describing of material determinism, are determining who you are, determining how you understand the world. And so the goal of the socialist in general, or the communist in general, I guess it's Marxist is the general word for it. The goal is to induce a class consciousness where the people in every single stratum of society understand how that's their position in society is shaping who they are, shaping their fundamental character. Now, if you translate this into the racial dimension and say that white supremacy is doing the exact same thing, you see that what Martin Luther King got wrong was based in naivety. That would be their interpretation. When he says he dreams of a world where his 4 little children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Content of character is determined by color of skin, by your relation to the power dynamic, to the structural racism in society that's being imposed upon you by by the white people who created the racial hierarchy and placed themselves conveniently enough at the top of it and created a mythology called white supremacy that maintains their position at the top of this. And so this is actually a different doctrine that's not called material determinism, it's called structural determinism. But it's the exact replication of what Stalin is describing with class relations and production relations being done now in social and cultural relations, and to a degree production, because they would say that they overlap, but that the class issue is actually understood more comprehensively through the race issue. So you can see then this rejection of Martin Luther King exists at the heart of the critical race theory approach. And I know you didn't ask specifically about that, but since we're trying to tie this to what's going on in race Marxism, you can see we read Stalin, tell you what Stalin means, see the exact same thing in critical race theory. You could do it. You read Marx, tell you what Marx meant, see the exact same thing in critical race theory. You can do it with Lenin, you can do it with Mao. Doesn't matter who you pick. You pick your favorite communist. We can do it with all of them, because it's critical race theory is a direct reproduction of Marxism using race as the central construct for understanding difference.
And is this sort of at the heart of the scam, that it's unfalsifiable? Either you agree with them or you disagree with them, and that's only because of your accident of birth, your social standing in society. Or Larry Elder, Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, even Dave Rubin, gay guy, the only reason they disagree with the progressives is because they have false consciousness. So
That's right.
You have covered every single base. Agree, disagree because of privilege and false consciousness. Is there any way to overcome something so ridiculously astronomical?
I mean, you have pinned it down. Those are exactly why it's unfalsifiable. And in fact, what it does is it puts theory ahead of practice. It puts theory ahead of reality. It gets it's funny because it calls itself the scientific study of history, but in the German tradition, in the early and mid 19th century, science was actually hierarchized differently than it is now. It was very early in the scientific revolutions, thinking like 1807 when Phenomenology of Spirit was written by Hegel, for example. It was very early. We hadn't really figured out what science was yet. We didn't really know what was going on. And so the question is, does the experiment come first? Kind of, this is a classic question for everybody in the sciences. Does experiment come first, or does theory come first? Right? And so their answer, under what in German is termed Wissenschaft, which is translated to science, typically. Wissenschaft is a broader category of science than we would call science. Wissenschaft, especially, is used in the 19th century, is a broader category of thing. And they actually, the idealists and even Marx, following from Hegel, these kind of German philosophers of that era, put theory first. They said that theory was more important than observation. Theory was more important than experiment. Theory was the comprehensive, systematic explanation that was based on reason. So, in fact, that's the translation they gave for the higher level of thought, is reason, Vernunft in German, that has to override Verstand, which is mere observation, which might be mistaken. So they put the primacy in theory rather than in experiment, and that actually turns out it gets science backwards. But they thought that they called what they were doing scientific. And Marx said that he had the true scientific study of history, for example. So what happens then is that everything has to conform to theory, or there must be some explanation for why you did it wrong when you put theory first. And that's what you see. So you see here, and you asked if there's any way to overcome it. The answer is yes. You expose that this is what's going on because people see that it's crap when they see what's going on. But until they see what's going on, it can be tricky and seductive. But what is going on to kind of expose it is that they, like you said, if you disagree with the theory, they put forth an explanation for something that comes out of the theory. If you disagree with it, you must either have privilege. In both cases, you have some form of false consciousness. Privilege induces by its structural or material determinism, as we were just talking about, a false consciousness that makes you think I deserve this. And then if you're Larry Elder or whoever else, you're just trying to cash in on the reward, or you've bought into the prevailing ideology and you don't understand the true nature of your class standing, whether it's racial class standing, whether it's material class standing, and therefore you have a false consciousness that's been introjected into you, is usually the word that they use, by the ideologists who get to operate in the upper class of society, in the superstructure of society. So they create the mythology. They say this is how it works, and basically most of them believe it, so they have privilege, and then are willfully ignorant in their privilege of the real nature of structural nature of reality. And then the lower class, a lot of them end up adopting the ideology. They fall for it. This is big mythology for how society is supposed to work. And a lot of the underclass also accepts this. And then they become people like Larry Elder, who get classified as the black face of white supremacy by the LA Times when he runs for governor. Or like we just saw with Clarence Thomas. Yesterday, the Washington Post described Clarence Thomas as the black justice who tends to uphold white supremacy, or speak like white supremacists or something like that. And so this is the only explanation available to you when you run into the blatant contradiction. But that comes from having put your theory first, and your theory being this very kind of cartoonish, simplistic explanation of social relations that says if you believe in something like material or structural determinism, your character, who you are, and what you should think is determined by those social relations that are happening. As for Marx, he said it limits the range of your subjectivity in his 1844 manuscript. Social relations limit the range of subjectivity, who you are as a subject. You have a narrowed understanding of the world around you based on the ideology permeating into you and limiting your subjectivity. And so you can't truly understand what's happening. So you have some form of false consciousness one way or the other. And therefore the theory is still correct, even though you have something that completely diverges from it, because it has no explanatory tools to understand reality outside of its theory. The question of how do you defeat that is you expose that that's what's going on. Is that it thinks it has, in its pride, it thinks it has the answer to every question ahead of time. Like where Ibram Kendi in his 2019 Politico, How Do You Fix Inequality? He says, we make an anti-racist constitutional amendment based on two principles. And the first of the two principles is racial inequity is evidence of racist policy. In other words, they have the answer in hand. No matter what happens, they know what the answer of why it happened is. And when people see that they have their answer for the why already in hand, no matter what happens, you can see that it's a scam. And when people see that it's a scam, they'll reject it. And when they see that the point of this scam is to empower the people who talk and act like this, that it's a power grab, then, we start coming back to these kind of very classically liberal or libertarian values like we have in the Tennessee state constitution here. Article 1, Section 2 says that the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power is to be considered slavish, absurd, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. So when you see that it's a power grab, you see that it's a bid to grab power, not based on competence, not based on right answers, not based on something that will benefit society, but based on something arbitrary, which is this kind of cartoonish theory, and then people will actually reject it. You can't, however, beat an unfalsifiable theory on its own terms, because its own terms the books are cooked. It wins, the house wins every time, and it's not even like a casino where the house takes like a penny per dollar. It's like the house takes like $1 per dollar. The house wins everything all the time because it's so kind of simplistic and cartoonish.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, anytime they say the employer voluntarily offering you products, services, an entry-level job, that's evil exploitation. BLM burning down your cities, well, those are your comrades. They're really in things with you. That is just so ridiculous. But the way you explained it perfectly illustrates how we can have the example of North Korea and South Korea, and then say, God, we need to move closer to communism. East Germany versus West Germany. Gosh, we need more communism. Richard Wolff still uses China, who at what was it, 1979, had some of the greatest free market reforms. Even though they're still communist politically, some of the greatest moves towards private property until like India in 1991 had their reforms. He still uses China today as as an example of socialism, as opposed to saying the socialism failed until they moved more capitalists. So in every aspect of this ideology, they try to really corner you in. And that's why I love how, well, I want to move on to the definitions here. You define critical race theory as one, calling everything you want to control racist until it's fully under your control. Two, a Marxian conflict theory of race, i.e. race Marxism. Three, a belief that racism created by white people for their own benefits is the fundamental organizing principle of society. So from there, I want to compare that definition to Critical Race Theory and Introduction, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefantik. They say, what is critical race theory? CRT movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Why is your definition right and theirs wrong?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to look at things. This is like how do the words work? Etic and emic perspective, insider perspective and outsider perspective. I mean, theirs is correct from the inside. If you believe that there is a structural power system of racism that organizes society, then their definition is what you're going to give. What I actually am more comfortable doing is taking, so that's the very first sentence, it turns out, of Critical Race Theory and Introduction. That's on page 2. You can derive my third definition, which is the one that's kind of the most serious, the one that actually has, I mean, the other ones don't really have actionable parts. Neo-Marxist, conflict theory of race does. We could do that. But you can actually derive the belief that the fundamental organizing principle of society is racism created by or to the benefit of white people. You can derive that from Delgado and Stefanchik's definition if you just kind of step back and stop believing in their doctrine. And so what are they saying? They say it's a movement of activists and scholars who are dedicated to changing the relationship among race, racism, and power. And if you go on, they criticize traditional approaches to civil rights. And they say that, it wants to fundamentally overthrow the liberal order. They go on in the, preceding paragraph, the later paragraphs in the book, in the chapter, they go on to explain that racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society, not an aberration from them. It's so-called normal science. It's page 7 or something. It's a few pages down when they lay out the tenets of critical race theory. And so their definition isn't wrong. Their definition is narrow and presented from the inside to make it look right. It is actually correct to say that it is a movement of activists and scholars dedicated to transforming society in terms of race, racism, and power. They certainly want to do that. They want to empower themselves to do it. But if you start reading how they want to organize that, you'll see that the belief is that there is an organizing principle of society, a structure called structural racism or systemic racism, that is how society actually works, so that racism becomes the ordinary state of affairs of society, not an aberration from them, and so on. And so in the very first part of the first chapter, I take some pains to derive, mostly from Delgado and Stefanchik, that third definition that I give. I put the kind of punchy practical one first, because I think that's really all anybody needs to know about critical race theory. The kind of exhaustive summary is second. It is a neo-Marxist theory of race, or conflict theory of race. That's all it is. It's really what critical race theory is. And then, the one that actually explains how it works, the one that you actually can derive from Delgado and Stefanchik, who are not wrong. They're speaking from within the system that believes that that's what needs to happen. They're accurately describing their own beliefs, but they're not accurately describing their own beliefs to outsiders. They're explaining them to people who think in terms of systems and structures, which is already a Marxist perspective on how the world works. When you take that outside, you end up with this belief that the way that society is organized at a fundamental level is that white people ordered it for themselves and created a ideology called white supremacy to justify why people who get access to whiteness get to be the privileged class of society, and everybody else is exploited by them or alienated from the society they participate in by the nature of those social relations.
They go on to say, as you said, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order. So here we have a move that they've done where they've said, really, you know what, you can't be saying that we need to talk about this and get these incremental wins. We basically have such a big problem. There's so much racism that only a giant power grab, let's call it the dictatorship of the proletariat, only that can be the solution to something so terrible. Because when their government schools are terrible, they say, well, let's just reform them. Maybe they need more money. When their environmental predictions fail, when their COVID predictions fail, they go, there's nothing wrong here. We just need more money for education. We need to fix things. But when it comes to economic exchanges, well, this needs to be violently overthrown, and we need an absolute revolution. So is this the aim of why they're dividing the races, why they try and divide the sexes, so they could say there's such a big problem that only a really big state run by us with our cronies in the press and big tech in alliance, this is our solution to something so big, giving us a ton of power?
Yeah, I mean, when the question becomes, if you're going to reject incremental and step-by-step progress, and then go on to say you're going to question the very foundations of the existing social order, you are talking about a revolutionary ideology. If we go back to Kendi with his brilliant proposal for a constitutional amendment, an anti-racist constitutional amendment to fix inequality, he says that it should establish a Department of Anti-Racism that would have authority to pre-clear all local, state, and federal policy to make sure it won't yield racial inequity. It says that it would also have jurisdiction over private policy wherever racial inequity surfaces, and that it would monitor thoughts and expressions of racism from public officials and be empowered to punish them if they don't voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. That's a dictatorship of the anti-racists. You say dictatorship of the proletariat that sees the means of production, that's a dictatorship of the proletariat. They're seizing all of the political order for themselves under a doctrine of anti-racism with the explicit goal of creating what? Equity. Well, if you look at Marx, his goal was to take out of capitalism, have the proletariat, the working class, rise up, seize control of the means of production, create a dictatorship of the proletariat, which was going to do what? Enforce equitable material outcomes in a state called socialism. So equity, racial equity, is the cultural, sociocultural, and somewhat material reinvention of socialism, and it is going to be enforced by a dictatorship of the anti-racists. Literally, he calls it a Department of Anti-Racism, DOA. It's kind of funny that it's the same letters you'd have for dictatorship of the anti-racists. In a direct parallel to Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a direct parallel. It's the exact same model. And then we're going to enforce racial equity. And what Marx believed was that if you enforce socialism long enough, and this is why with the children that the young people that you mentioned at the beginning, you quoted the stats, 70% almost accept socialism, 30% or something accept communism. They're the same thing. Technically, socialism is a very broad category. There are many approaches to socialism, but within the Marxist ideology, and a lot of people don't understand this, socialism is the preceding step to communism. Socialism eventually becomes communism in the Marxist ideology. There are other ways, like, for example, George Orwell was a socialist. There have been other people who are socialists who have different approaches to the idea of democratic versions of socialism. Certainly, George Orwell was anti-totalitarian. So he believed in kind of a redistributive state, but he didn't believe in totalitarianism. It's very obvious from everything he wrote. And so there are different theories of socialism, but when you get into the Marxist theory of socialism, which I capitalize throughout the book with a capital S, when you get into the Marxist theory of socialism, it's just a stepping stone to communism. There is no accepting socialism without accepting communism, because socialism is a stepping stone to communism. What you have in critical race theory is this reinvention. Colorblind equality has to be overthrown because it doesn't work. So capitalism has to be overthrown because it doesn't work. It will be taken over by a dictatorship of the anti-racists who will enforce equity, a redistributive state where people get equal outcomes, just like in socialism. Eventually that'll become spontaneous, but instead of communism, we'll finally have achieved racial justice. And so the idea of social justice becomes kind of the sociocultural parallel to the idea of communism. And of course, the material aspects are going to be contained within that. The reason they say that there are more poor black people than there are poor white people, even though I don't think these statistics actually work out, is because racism. So they're going to have a material redistribution built into this. They call that reparations, built in. So racial justice occurs when all of those inequities of all of history are undone, and they're not being made anymore because equity has been enforced long enough so that it became spontaneous. And it's a direct recreation, again, of Marx's ideas. But the young people who, socialism is not a softer version of communism. As a matter of fact, it's a psychotic version of communism. It is the totalitarian application of communism until it works, which it'll never do. There are other theories of socialism, like kind of democratic socialist ideas that can be softer, although obviously the Bolsheviks called their program democratic socialism too. But there are softer versions of socialism that we can incorporate into a mixed economy that can work out to varying degrees, or that are worthy social experiments. But the young people are very confused, because the entire program, the Marxists are extremely good at co-opting all positive sentiment towards socialism into their brand of socialism, which is always on the road to communism, according to their weird religious belief about how society works, and therefore always on the road to ruin. It's because it will always fail, because it's not a realistic theory. It doesn't know how humans work, doesn't know how economies work, it doesn't know how exchange works, and it's a calamity every single time as a result.
Well, you can look at how they, represent the downtrodden and the masses, unless they vote for Brexit, which is, like one of the most democratic things you can do, or unless they vote for Trump, or unless the workers of the trucking industry unite in Canada, well, then it's pure evil. So what you can do is sort of give them an out. You can say, do you support all of these, what Robert Nozick would call capitalist acts between consenting adults? And when they're constantly vilifying those, well, then you can see that this war on white supremacy, they want to replace with government supremacy. It's not like people don't have health care, so we need to start a GoFundMe or a Give, Send, Go or an Indiegogo, and then AOC is going to redistribute it. Instead, what happens is AOC lies about Abuela losing her house in a storm. Matt Welch raises the money for her. Turns out the story's fake, and they don't even take the money. But they won't let you opt out of using their systems. They close your bank accounts like Trudeau did. And then they went to Give, Send, Go, and then the government of Canada officially stepped in. So it's not, well, they do believe in equality. They literally want government supremacy, which is equally as immoral and way more deadly throughout history, with the alleged white supremacy. So here's the question to you, that someone very well-intentioned could easily say the following: society is structured and created of, for, and by whites. Look at the history of slavery, Jim Crow. All of this minority mistreatment is at the heart of American history. Now we have to compensate for that. One of the many ways we can do this is critical race theory. Well, maybe we could even move past that, but you have to admit that that's true. How do you respond?
That's a genetic fallacy. That's how I respond. Like, something beginning in a particular way does not indicate that that's how it's actually still proceeding, unless you believe that things actually cannot change, and therefore you're really regressive, as opposed to believing in the capacity for progress. I can give fairly colorful examples, like, just to not be gross about it like I was on Twitter recently, but to be more kind. You started life as a baby. You were stupid. You couldn't even talk. You couldn't focus your eyes on anything. You're staring around in the world. So you started your life as a baby. So are we supposed to think that you're still stupid, that you can't talk, that you can't focus your eyes on things, or did something change? You're not the same thing as from where you came. Or if we wanted to take an evolutionary argument, I said this actually on Twitter. I said some grosser things too. But we could take an evolutionary argument and say that your grandsires were fish. You go back far enough, 180 million years, your parents, in direct lineage to you was some kind of a fish flopping around in the mud trying to breathe. Does that mean that we should treat you as though you're a fish? No, of course not. It's a genetic fallacy to say that our society was originally organized for white people, which turns out not to be true. It's very complicated if you actually read the things that were written between the late 17th century and the early 19th century. It's not actually completely true that it was organized for white people. It was organized for property holders. And in fact, one of the arguments that Lincoln gave for the abolition of slavery was, in fact, that there were black property holders when the Confederation, or when the Constitutional Convention was held in all but 2 or 3 states, or I guess colony. And there were states at that point. So we're talking 10 or 11 out of the 13 at the time actually had any property holder over the age of 21 could vote and could send delegates, and that black people in 10 or 11 out of there's some historical debate about that. Of those 10 or 11 of those states, black people voted to send delegates because they were property holders. It had nothing to do with race at the very beginning of the country, except in like Georgia and South Carolina, which were the kind of hardest core slave states at the time. And so Lincoln's argument was, actually, black people contributed there to the formation of the Constitution. So it was, in fact, their Constitution as well. They voted to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So it was part. So the organizational principle of society was even more complicated than this narrative tries to portray. Now, am I denying that slavery occurred? No, of course not. Am I denying that it had material and serious other impacts? No, of course not. Same thing with, Jim Crow laws and segregation, et cetera. But if you actually look at what's caused a lot of this damage, and you look at the different racial groups, if you want to think that way in society, and look at how people are performing, the variables that determine outcomes are very rarely, they're often somewhat correlated or even highly correlated with race, but they are very rarely able to be dragged down to causation by race. What you actually find is that there are other, we could even call them structural or systemic variables, and they might have been done, these might be racially motivated in some cases, but the fact is that having 2 parents in the home is the biggest predictor of academic success that goes on to later life success. Economic class. Marx was more right than these weirdos. Economic class actually has more to do with your capacity to get into the, if your parents have lots of money and lots of connections, they can hook you up with people who have the opportunity for you to get a sweet job. And so economic class is actually much more determinant in terms of, kind of perpetuated social stratification than, say, race was. But then you go even deeper. I mentioned the 2-parent household thing. Look at the policies that destroyed that. The black family was one of the strongest institutions in America right up until they changed all the welfare law under Lyndon Johnson. With the Great Society program, one of the most racist sets of policies that's ever come into play. So was that the white man holding down the black man? Well, maybe, but if it was, it's like it was the progressives that did it. And so something's wrong in the theory because it was the failure of progressive policy that actually created the problem. And so what I would say is that analysis is facile. It's emotionally resonant. It gets you going, but it's facile. It's based on a number of fallacies. It's based on a particular logical fallacy, genetic fallacy, and it's further based upon an oversimplistic and motivated reading of all of history. And it's a what's called the univariate fallacy, where you collapse a multivariable problem to a single variable and say that's the causative one, where in fact it might not only not be causative, but it might in fact be very minor or almost irrelevant in terms of causation. And so the whole analysis is plagued by a large number, and I agree, a lot of good faith people make this argument. It's plagued by a number of very basic, very easy to see fallacies: logical fallacy, statistical fallacy, and misreading of history, like literally just being erroneous in the progression of how the relevant history was laid out. And so it's the best word for that is that it's facile. It is a childish understanding that does none of the actual, they say do the work. It does none of the work of actually understanding what's going on.
And it doesn't account for the alternative explanation that instead of whites benefiting, some benefited at the expense of others. It's like saying the Spanish benefited from imperialism. Spain did, and Britain did, and America benefits with its imperialism today. No, it's not America in general. It's like Raytheon and Boeing benefit at the expense of all other Americans. So you're taking this microscopic amount, the Queen of Spain, let's say, who goes to take all the gold from these places and redistribute it to her and her cronies back in Spain. Well, all the taxpayers had to actually compensate the state for the voyages that went out there. It's not like it was then evenly distributed and everyone was was in favor of voting for more imperialism. Or take the examples of Britain. Or I guess Adam Smith was talking about the examples of places like France and their imperialist endeavors historically, that these things only come at the expense. So blaming all whites for slavery is like blaming all blacks for rape today, or all blacks for murder and all looting today. It's equally as racist and ridiculous. You could say the same thing for men are 95% of those killed by police, yet only 50% of the population. Therefore, female supremacy exists. I mean, it's that childish.
It's extraordinarily facile. It's the kind of analysis that in a healthy functioning society that hadn't been colonized. And you actually showed the relevant statistic, by the way. 17% of social science professors identify as Marxist. If you had a healthy academia where you have people whose job it literally is to look at these kinds of things and to create reports about them, they would have seen through this as childish and exposed it as laughable, rather than being the primary purveyors of it, rather than having been the people who wrote thousands and thousands of pages of this nonsense. Now, just to give you an example, when I say thousands of pages, I've mentioned the paper, Cheryl Harris's paper, Whiteness as Property. The paper is over 90 pages long. It's just page after page after page after page of sophistry to make out a theoretical explanation. So what happened is that the academics who we should have been able to entrust to see through these terrible explanations, not only did they fail to do so, but they actually created the architecture so that if anybody else tried to, that they got called names like racist for attempting to. So when you say these alternative explanations for what might have been going on, all of those are just classified as racist in the unfalsifiable theory, just like previous generations of Marxists would have just classified that as bourgeois. In fact, the reason we won World War II is probably because the Germans, even before Hitler took the chancellorship, were profoundly kind of buying into Marxist ideas. And then during the early part, remember, it is National Socialism, right? Hitler hated the Marxists. If you read Mein Kampf, he hated the Marxists, but he adopted a lot of their ideas. He says that too. And they actually regarded theoretical physics, in particular relativity theory, as Jewish science. And so Germany put itself behind in terms of creating the atom bomb by possibly as much of a decade, where they had the best scientists in the world. They had the best opportunity in the world. They had the most organized and efficient war machine, and scientific machine that the world's ever produced, and for the era at the time. And they completely bonked on nuclear power and nuclear weaponry because they thought that relativity theory, having been created by Albert Einstein, was a Jewish plot, this Jewish science, and they couldn't use that crap. And so it's exactly the same kind of mentality. The communists called everything they didn't like bourgeois science. So millions of people, possibly as many as 100 million people, have died of starvation in the Soviet Union and China because of Trofim Lysenko's bogus Soviet agriculture. And they did the same thing. The Soviets got behind in the nuclear arms race at the beginning because they considered physics in general to be bourgeois science. And just like real agriculture and real biology were bourgeois science. And so this demonization of anything that might possibly expose their theory as fraudulent leads to, kind of absolute catastrophe. Eventually, of course, they have to come up with some explanation at 1,000 pages of theory later for why theoretical physics is actually great. And it's actually with the Germans, what they did is they said that, oh, well, it wasn't that it was Jewish people who thought this up. It's that they were German Jews. So it was actually Jewish science, not Jewish science, but German science that was on the forefront of theoretical physics. And they just pretended they didn't completely get that wrong for racist reasons. Well, critical race theory is doing the same thing, but frankly, even stupider. Everything that could possibly disagree with it's getting called racist. It gets called white supremacist or racist. And that's why I put that first definition in the book. Call everything you want to control racist until you control it, is the fundamental characterization of how critical race theory actually operates.
Before getting into more depressing stuff, but the number of blacks in professional, technical, and other high-level occupations more than doubled in the decade preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other occupations, gains by blacks were greater during the 1940s, when there was practically no civil rights legislation, than during the 1950s. In various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. Affirmative action hiring pressures make it costly to have no minority employees, but continuing affirmative action pressures at the promotion and discharge phases also make it costly to have minority employees who do not work out well. The net effect is to increase the demand for highly qualified minority employees while decreasing the demand for less qualified minority employees, or for those without a sufficient track record to reassure employers. When it comes to the real-world results of wokeism and critical race activism, what have been the real-world results?
I mean, that right there is just a super friendly picture compared to what the real world results of applying critical race theory have been. Critical race theory is a Marxist theory, so therefore it is a theory of division and hate. And so everywhere it goes, it creates division and hate. The point of Marx, if you read Marx's manifesto, he's very clear. The point is to awaken people to class antagonism. And the best way to do that is to create class antagonism. Lenin put this very succinctly when he was asked about the starving people throughout the Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine. He said, we must accelerate the contradictions. The working class won't become a revolutionary class till they see the contradictions for themselves. So accelerate the contradictions. In other words, starve more people. So what you see with critical race theory is that if you want to create if you want people to see racial class antagonism, you need to create racial class antagonism. This is exactly what it does. Everywhere it goes, it's like, let's make all the workplace issues more race conscious. And what this causes is racial class antagonism. And then they can point at that and they say, look, racial class antagonism. There's so much racism here. But this is the snake oil mechanism. Snake oil is fake medicine that makes you sicker. And then the person selling it to you says, well, see, that's the poison coming out. That's, you get worse before you get better, or whatever it happens to be. You need to take more of the fake medicine. You need to buy another 100 bottles of it and drink them or whatever, but it's actually poison. So you see, for example, in workplaces where diversity training is being brought in under the guise of critical race theory, and they say, well, we need to awaken racial consciousness. We need to talk about racial privilege. We need to have a racial reckoning, or whatever the phraseology that they tend to use is. And what happens is they get everybody. I've heard countless accounts, firsthand accounts of people telling me this, that there'll be the brown person at work, if you will, or the black person at work, and they get put down in the middle, and everybody in the room has to go around and say how secretly racist they are. This does not create a harmonious working environment. All these people you thought were your friends, and this is a report, all these people you have to go to work with every day are now confessing to you. And imagine, there's this weird social pressure you always have to be the person. You can't have nothing to say. You can't say, well, I'm just not racist. That's ridiculous. I kind of like you guys. You can't say that, because then you're just denying it under the doctrine, your false consciousness of the privilege type. And so you have that problem. And then B, there's a social dynamic where people are always trying to kind of like, have you ever been in one of these groups where you go around the whole circle and everybody has to tell like the little story of why they're there? And the first guy's story is like 30 seconds long. And then by the time you get to like the last two people, they're like telling like this 19-minute sob story about this most complicated possible. Everybody's trying to one up everybody before them. And so what you end up, this is what people are reporting to me happens when they actually do these trainings. And, this particular guys. So then you have all these people saying all this crazy racist stuff they think about and say whatever to the people. And then those people are like, wow, I didn't think you were racist. And now I think you're racist. And now you have racial class antagonism is visible. And then they, this is what they actually say is make oppression visible. That's their point of their theory, or make class antagonism visible in the Marxist language. That's literally the point of their theory. And they call that raising racial consciousness. And they think that's part of the progressive direction. Turns out it's a catastrophe. It's exactly the opposite. Everywhere it's put into practice, they get exactly the opposite result. They put this stuff into the schools. They say that you can't have, good academic outcomes unless you're culturally competent. And everywhere that they're doing this, the schools are having like 30% or less literacy rates, mathematics rates, et cetera. Why? Because they're not teaching literacy. They're not teaching mathematics. They're not teaching science. They're teaching social justice crap through these lenses. This goes back to Paulo Freire, the Marxist educator from Brazil, who laid this out. He has this book, The Politics of Education, from 1985. That was the book that broke him into the North American education world. And in the first 5 or 6 chapters of that book, which are brutally boring, he talks about, we shouldn't just teach the Brazilian peasants to read. It wouldn't be relevant. Don't teach them about phonics. Don't teach them about syllables. Don't teach them about words. Don't teach them vocabulary. No, teach them lessons relevant to their lives. Tell them, use examples of how they're oppressed. So, the dirty capitalist stole all of your money. Those are the sentences we're going to practice learning how to read. And then what they're focused on is some other distraction away from the actual lesson. So what do you see? You see this stuff get implemented in schools. You see catastrophes. Now, there's one other aspect here. You see catastrophes and learning loss. You see the learning loss. We talk about learning loss from the pandemic. The learning loss from critical theories is out of control. Nobody's learning anything, but they're all learning how to complain and be activists. They're not learning any relevant skills whatsoever. But this isn't even like the biggest problem with implementing these social theories. I mean, the division, all of this crap, the learning loss. This isn't even the biggest problem. There are far bigger problems in that this is probably the most. I call this the iron law of woke corruption. It is the most corruptible ideology, the easiest thing in the universe to grift. If you want to be a grifter with something like critical race theory, because it's inherently subjective, all you have to do is talk about your damn lived experience. I feel like blah, blah, blah. Oh, I've been racist my whole life. And you go on like your Robin DiAngelo confession tour. It's the easiest thing in the world to grift. If you want to be a grifter, all you have to do is just start saying this stuff, and it can be completely fake. You could be completely making it up. And so where you see rampantly everywhere this is, you see corruption, you see grifting, you see manipulation. So where critical race theory or any other Marxist theory, this has been throughout history, is implemented, you see corruption. You see massive amounts of corruption. And that's probably the biggest cost. The whole program, the diversity program that they sell based on this critical theory of race, for example, or queer theory or gender theory or disability theory or whatever else, what you actually, I mean, the product produces the opposite of what they're selling it for. And then there's this huge grift where they put the consultant comes in and says, I'm going to tell you how you're secretly racist and don't even realize it. And I'm the only person who can tell you this. By the way, for 100,000 taxpayer dollars, I will implement a program to tell you how to get rid of it. And if you don't, we're going to tell everybody how racist you are and how we found out about it. So we're going to run literally an extortion racket. Literal racketeering is going on to implement extremely expensive things that the taxpayer, and I said 100,000, that's like, you bring in Ibram Kendi to speak 3 times, there's your $100,000. And if you don't bring him in to speak, they were racist. You're a racist because you wouldn't let him come in and speak. But, some of these ed programs are $3 million, $10 million, et cetera, of taxpayer money going into what amounts literally to a racketeering grift. It is the equivalent of the mob. And if you know anything about communism, that's exactly how the communists work too. They come in, they shake you down. If you don't participate and do it exactly what they want and give them whatever bribes or whatever it is that they want, then they're going to figure out some pretext to destroy you, that you're counter-revolutionary, the whatever it happens to be. And you look at Mao's China, they would turn the mob on you and have your entire, your business, your place of residence or whatever destroyed by the angry mob, by unleashing them, by having either the press or some government official come out and say, well, we think that these people have counter-revolutionary sentiment. They're not part of the party. And everybody knows if they're not the one, just like with what was it when like Khrushchev would come out and speak, nobody would dare be the first person to stop clapping. Right, so that you'd have the clapping, like vigorous clapping, and everybody looking very excited for like 10 minutes every time he'd come out to speak, like just absurd, because whoever stopped first was going to get shot. And so whoever doesn't go destroy the business or whatever is going to get shot. This is literally racketeering.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at David Dorn. The guy survives Jim Crow's America only to get killed at a BLM protest. So,
right.
Yeah, they will literally kill people who, even if it looks like they're on their team, they are not not exactly on the same side. When it comes to decreasing the amount of unnecessary tension among people of goodwill, there's a few things that I have brought up in the past, and these have worked with me as far as just getting people to think. So a lot of people aren't familiar with the Code of Yernamu. This is an ancient law script it's dated like 2,000 years before Christ. And one of the primary words in it is slave, because they were discussing slavery. In my generation, kids in like the 25 area literally believe America invented slavery. Literally, that whites invented it in America. So that gives them a little context. In 1830, you can look at the U.S. Census. There were a higher percentage of black slave owners who were free blacks than there were whites, which is not to say it's a racial issue. It's just to say there's not one bad race and a good race. You could look at homicide stats where about 3% of the population, young black men, commit about half of the homicides. And as far as police brutality, names like Ashley Babbitt, Kelly Thomas, Tony Timpa, Duncan Lemp, Daniel Schaefer, all unarmed whites killed by police officers, and these are on camera. So when it comes to what can we tell people to decrease this unnecessary hatred and tension, what are some ideas you have?
Honestly, if the critical race theorists didn't poison everything, they would almost have good solutions. One of the things they talk about is having authentic relationships, right? Well, one of the best ways to do this is actually to have, they talk about the benefits of diversity. When you actually get a sort of diverse group working together for a common goal, right? You actually have bonding. Like if there are these commercials like some beer companies made where they would get these two people together and they'd have them put together a table or a bench or whatever, and they'd open up a beer. The goal is you build this and then we're going to drink the beer, and the branding is there for the commercial or whatever. And so they build this like IKEA table together, and then they sit at the table and they pop open the beer and they clink the bottles and they start drinking. They celebrate that they got their table built or whatever project it was they were doing. And then it's revealed, they have like a TV screen or whatever, where each of them has done like an interview about their political opinions or even racial opinions or whatever else. And it turns out that they're massively diametrically opposed to one another. And then what you find out is because they did a project together and they worked together and they trusted each other and that they are like, yeah, we're still going to be friends. Who cares? Because it actually brings people together. Shared goals, working together with shared goals actually achieves this. Now, the poison that really needs to be brought up is when people, need to understand is the difference between multiculturalism and pluralism. The United States with e pluribus unum is pluribus, pluralist. It is pluralist. That's what pluribus is about, right? From many, one. So means many. So you have, people who come over to the United States from various different countries, or their families have come over from different countries, and they retain various aspects of their culture, and they bring that. So you have, 800 different nationalities bring in different, or ethnicities bring in different kinds of food, and people doing different kinds of events. And, there's a place up here near where I live that does like a German fest every year. And so there's like German culture gets brought in. And then there's a place that does, like the Jewish thing, and there's the Jewish culture thing. There's all these different kind of, the synagogue puts it on, and there's like all these kind of things. But what you run into within the multicultural space, and this is what the critical race mentality with its race consciousness really pushes, is a cultural protectionism. It's the belief that, if you share cultures, then one culture is dominant over the other and is therefore exploiting the other. So you can't have, people getting together and just enjoying stuff as individuals, as people. You have to look at them through their ethnic or racial identity instead, and then think about the power dynamics. And that actually just makes it all awkward and breaks it apart. You don't have people getting together over barbecue. And, if I say barbecue, you don't know what race I'm talking about. Why? Because freaking everybody makes good barbecue, right? If I say barbecue, you might have thought of a white person or a black person, or if you speak Spanish and know about barbacoa, you might have thought even of like Latinos or whatever. Everybody makes barbecue. You can't get together over just enjoying, a nice barbecue. You can't do that. You have to be thinking in terms of power dynamics. So what's the remedy? Is you're thinking about people as individuals rather than as walking stereotypes. Stop doing that. Stop thinking that this structural determinism and material determinism is real. That is actually a farce. people are their own individuals, and they can think about their own context and their own circumstances, and they can decide who they want to be. Their character matters. And if you start seeing people as individuals, then you can get together and bond over things you share in common, like barbecue. And, you can get a whole bunch of different people together because everybody likes smoked meat. Everybody wants to eat that. So, or almost everybody. And so you can get people together and bring them together because they're seeing each other as individuals who have something in common or are doing projects in common, like a huge neighborhood barbecue or whatever else. Morgan Freeman said this years ago, and I know he's sort of woke now, but he had this interview with Mike Wallace, and they were talking about Black History Month, which we're in the middle of right now, as it were. And he says, I wish there wasn't one, or I don't want one. And he says, Mike Wallace is like, well, why? And he says, well, do you want a White History Month? He's like, well, I'm Jewish. And he says, well, do you want Jewish History Month? And he's like, no, I don't. And he says, well, why not? He's like, well, because, he gets all weird about it. And he just changes the subject. He says, well, how are we going to get over racism if we don't have Black History Month, if we don't, whatever? And Morgan Freeman says, stop talking about it. You're going to call me Morgan, and I'm going to call you Mike. And that's going to be it. We're going to be two people, two individuals. And so that common ground, common sensibility is actually the remedy. The founders of this country had it right. The idea that it's not a literal statement like about your brain or your thigh muscles or whatever. When they said all men are created equal, they meant politically equal. They meant that they have equal, set of assumptions given to them socially and culturally, so that we can come to the point where a statement like we're going to judge men by their content of character, regrettably, Martin Luther King didn't say, and the fruits of their merits as well, because that's really what it comes down to. Content of character and fruits of merits is how we should be judging people as individuals. What do you have and what did you do with it? And not based on some other characteristic. Where did you come from? What do you look like? Who do you like to have sex with? All of that's irrelevant. And so that individualism was the right answer. If we were religious, we would say, the imago Dei, that everybody's an image bearer of God. So we're all equal as image bearers of God, whatever our unique gifts and talents, etc., that God bestowed upon us. If we were religious, that's what we would say. That's actually the right idea. That was always the right idea. That works. It creates functioning societies across difference that can flourish. And then you create, a legal system that's not inherently biased. And so that when people can't resolve their disputes one-to-one, as man-to-man or person-to-person, then they can go to a, outside arbitrator that's going to help them mediate that situation. And there are a lot of different ways you can construct a legal system, but in a liberal system, we have the courts, and you don't go to court the second you and I disagree. We try to work it out, and we absolutely, where something's on the line where it matters, like property or something of value, and we can't resolve it, then we go to the court and we entrust somebody called a judge to make that decision for us. And you and I, whether we like each other or not, have to shake hands with the system at the end of the day and say, well, that's how it decided. And if we thought it was unfair, then we have a system of petitioning for redress that we can engage in to change the law so that maybe we still got screwed over, but somebody in the future won't. And, that system actually works. The system of conflict resolution that was put forth in the Republican model put forth by the founders when they wrote the Constitution, not a perfect system, but a seriously functional system. Those are the kinds of values that we really need to start stoking back in people. Individualism and republicanism. And I'm not talking about the Republican Party, GOP. I don't care about them. They're half corrupt or 90% corrupt too. I'm talking about the idea that you have a constitutional system with limited powers, divided powers, et cetera, et cetera. Go read your Constitution and see what it says. With, individual rights, secured. The point of the government is, in fact, to secure those rights and not to do much else. This is a really, really great system. And that's why, but it's also a fragile system. And that's why Benjamin Franklin famously came out and he was asked right after they drafted the Constitution in 1789, and they finished it and they approved it. And he came out and the lady asked him, what kind of government did you give us, sir? And he says, a republic, madam, if we can keep it. And so we're at the stage now where we've forgotten that we should try to keep this thing because it actually does resolve all those problems. Individualism, and then a low violence conflict resolution mechanism through something like rule of law. The law is not a person. It is separated from people. It is adjudicated by people, but no person is the law. No person is the science. Sorry, Anthony Fauci. No kings, nothing like that. And so what you have now is an impersonal thing that at the end of the day, if you and I can't resolve our dispute, this impersonal thing that is not a person, it is a book full of statutes, becomes the arbiter of how we're going to resolve our difference. And then we end up, whether we shake hands personally or not, in concept, we shake hands and we go back to living our lives because we ultimately believe not in the rule of kings, but in the rule of law, not in the rule of a party, but in the rule of a impersonal set of laws that are based in a government designed to maximize individual liberty and freedom.
One of the main things that swayed me away from being a progressive and embracing collectivism was literally, this meme summed it up so perfectly. It was collectivism, and it's two hands from different people cuffed together, and they're like going to shake, versus individualism is two people shaking hands. So you realize that individualism is not one person on an island all by himself. It's human beings seeing each other as rational creatures who are deserving of reason and exchange, as opposed to force, domination, and the concept of just blindly meshing people all together. Another really good one was individualism, everyone's in focus, and collectivism, everyone is completely blurry, and it's just an idea that, well, there's the workers. Well, how about the truckers? How about the people who work in the mines? Do you like what they do? Well, when I say the workers, I pin hundreds of millions of strangers to an idea and use that idea to beat people over the head with until I get reelected. So the concept of individualism, I think, is so vitally important. Are you good for another 30 minutes or so?
Yeah, we can do a little bit more.
Awesome.
In fact, that makes me think of a point from Marxism that's very important to understand, is that Marx's vision was to create what he called socialist man. And socialist man is a man who realizes that he lives for society, that society and man are actually co-continuous. They are the same thing in just different forms. And so this is intrinsically totalitarian, because the only way that the Marxist idea, if it were voluntary, I don't think it would work, but it sounds wonderful. But the trick is that it's not voluntary, because the belief is that the Marxist program would only work when everybody as individual subjects adopts the same mentality. Marxism is only believed to work. True communism is only tried when everybody's on board. So everybody has to think the same way. And that's the intrinsic flaw. That will never happen. For Marx, the goal is to elevate yourself from man to man in himself to socialist man. That is actually the goal of the program. Man in himself is independent of all other things, and then he has an awakening of consciousness that it's not independence, it's interdependence on the entire society. But the problem is for Marx that the program doesn't work unless everybody thinks this way. So it cannot tolerate difference. It cannot tolerate difference of opinion, and it cannot resolve conflicts between differences of opinion, because everybody has to think the same way or the whole program doesn't work. The whole social structure won't work if even one person thinks the wrong way. And so it's intrinsically totalitarian. So it's intrinsically based not just on collectivism, but on not even material bondage, but cognitive bondage. I don't mean to draw a impolitic parallel, but it's very similar to the concept in Islam. Islam means submission. And so the idea, and you've often heard it's a religion of peace. And the idea there is the kind of linguistic trick being played there is that we will have peace when everybody submits to the will of God. And that's the core belief actually of Islam. And different Muslims believe it in different ways. They believe that peace can be interpreted internally, and when they submit, they can have peace. But certain are political totalitarians, and they believe that until everybody submits to the same will of God in the same way, which they conveniently will interpret for everybody, then it's impossible to have peace, and they'll make sure of it because they'll keep waging war until we have it. And so, you can see how it's a very corrupt system. It's the same thing. Marxism works in a very similar way. You can't have communism until everybody is a man who understands that he is a man in his society. In other words, that he is a social man who believes in the social program, who in other words is a socialist, who believes in the ideology of the social program. In other words, that he is and eventually who believes in the concept of global commune, who is a communist. And so until everybody is a communist, communism can't work. Everybody must, they wouldn't say submit, but rather elevate to a communist consciousness, or else it won't work. And so anywhere you have an ideology that believes that it won't work until everybody's on the same page, you have a catastrophe in the making. This is completely different than liberalism, which is literally designed, classical liberalism, gold flag, whatever, what we would call libertarianism today, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, John Locke. That's actually a conflict resolution system that says, nope, people never agree on anything. People never agree. So what we need to do is figure out how to resolve the conflicts without people shooting each other in the face in a duel, or sticking a sword in each other's throat in a duel, or having a bunch of people in the mob show up with pitchforks and torches and burn down the town hall because they didn't get their way. We need to figure out a conflict resolution system. And this is where I become at tremendous odds with kind of harder core conservatives and the right wing, because they don't understand that liberalism is a conflict resolution mechanism that eschews violence, that minimizes violence and elevates the rights of the individual to the highest degree possible. Given that we are going to live in a society, the liberal solution to society isn't to give everybody a social program. It's to tell them you're allowed to cooperate with who you choose to cooperate with, when you choose to cooperate with them, on terms that you both find agreeable. And so there's a completely voluntarist system, which therefore maximizes liberty and minimizes coercion and force, while providing pathways. This is republicanism that provides pathways out of violent resolution of conflicts that will inevitably arise. So the view of humanity and liberalism is, in fact, people never get along. And the view of humanity and things like communism are, we can force everybody to get along by making them all think the same thing. And that's why it becomes totalitarian. In the end, you eventually are going to, like you're seeing in Canada right now, you're going to have to apply force to make everybody think the same way. You know, I was just in an airport the other day, and I was walking, and I heard over the loudspeaker, "We are all in this together," telling us to wear masks in the airport, which don't do anything. And the first thing I thought was, we're not all in this together. This is ridiculous. And then simultaneously, though, I look at what's going on in Canada, and you see people like Trudeau explaining, well, we're going to have freedom again when everybody does what we say. Slavery is freedom. Literally, when everybody does exactly what we say, then people will be free. As long as you can have all the privileges that we feel like giving to you, as long as you continue to do exactly what we say in place of their rights. And it's absolute submission to a alleged social contract that's going to be mediated by people who are going to appoint themselves as the grifters of that new social contract. That's the calamity of it every single time. And we see it playing out. You keep bringing up the truckers, see it playing out in Canada blatantly. You have a workers' rebellion, and the Marxists, literally the Marxists, the Communist Party of Canada, came out and is mad and denounced the Communist Party denounced a workers' rebellion against a pharmaceutical industry tyranny. Are you kidding me?
There is an essay titled A Critique of Pure Tolerance by Herbert Marcuse. What is the main lesson and major takeaways of this essay?
Okay, so the key thing, so that's actually a book of essays, and the key essay is called Repressive Tolerance, which he wrote in 1965. And so the key takeaway of repressive tolerance is movement, and this is literally in there, almost word for word, the movement, we must extend tolerance to movements from the left, and we must withdraw tolerance from movements from the right. Can't get more plain than that. We're going to, as we would say in critical race theory, level the playing field. In other words, we're going to give advantage to the left because they perceive themselves to be the constant victim and underdog. So they believe themselves to be in a constantly downward position or downtrodden position. So we're going to force a so-called leveling of the playing field by elevating that which comes from the left and repressing that which comes from the right. Now, he's pretty explicit. He talks about in this essay the difference between revolutionary and reactionary violence. And anything that maintains the status quo is reactionary violence. That's from the right. That is always used to oppress and enslave and hurt and harm. So the right is never allowed to use violence, not that I would advocate for it anyway. But then he says revolutionary violence is a different question. He says, of course, violence is always unethical. He says this. But when have ethics ever mattered in the making of history? And he says that. while justifying the left using violence in order to overthrow the system, because he says that the right maintaining the system is intrinsically violent. It's intrinsically upholding a system that is doing violence to people. It's oppressing them. It's excluding them from opportunities. It's causing them, privation and starvation and all these other issues. So it is intrinsically doing violence. So the only answer to that is to do violence back in the other direction. So violence from the right must be suppressed in all forms, and violence from the left is to be encouraged. That's the notion of repressive tolerance, which he also calls liberating tolerance. And then he goes on to say that the problem with the right, in fact, is that the idea ever even enters their head. The conservative idea ever even enters their mind. So he says that you have to engage in a prevention of not just the act or the deed, but also the word ever entering their thought. And so he says this constitutes censorship and pre-censorship, but it's justified, he says, because the entirety of society is in a state of clear and present danger of tipping into fascism if we don't elevate the left and essentially achieve socialism in short order. And so that is his key. That's the key takeaway from this book, is that if you're too tolerant, what you actually do is uphold the status quo. You uphold you give an unfair advantage to right-wing and reactionary and fascistic elements, according to Marcuse. But if you suppress the right and elevate the left, you actually can finally achieve what might be a better world, by which he means communism. He actually says in the essay, certain historical possibilities that have come to be regarded as utopian possibilities, which he means, that's a big long phrase. It means communism. Certain historical possibilities, Marx saw communism as a fulfillment of history, that have come to be regarded as utopian, impossible possibilities.
There is a general idea in the manifesto that there would be sort of a state drastically expanding. In his 10 points, he mentions there being a very powerful state controlling education, monopolizing credit. Big banks are terrible, but a monopoly bank is really good. That just all nonsense. He then says this will lead that you have the current state being sort of the committee for the bourgeoisie. But if the proletariat overtakes that, drastically expands it, there will no longer be a need for this committee of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, the state will wither away. In other words, to get rid of the state, give it a ton of power, which is as ridiculous as to get rid of the Koch brothers, give the Koch brothers a ton of power. To get rid of the Proud Boys, let's give them a ton of power. You'd never fall for such a scam in your entire life. How is it that such a blatant scam, like give them a ton of power and then the state will wither away, how does the Marxian mindset justify something so ridiculous in its theory? Of course, we had mentioned the theory and practice dialectic earlier. And how does it translate to race today?
So if you understand you have to understand that theory is a stand-in for faith. I don't know if you know that the original title for the Communist Manifesto, which Engels, I don't remember actually if Marx or Engels shot down the idea, but I think it was Engels, but I might have that backwards. The original title was the Communist Confession of Faith for the Communist Manifesto. But I think they thought that was a little too on the nose. I mean, this is easy to look up. It's not like it's a hidden fact of secret history. The original title in 1847, it was published in 1848, for the first draft was the Communist Confession of Faith. And so you have to think of it as a faith. And the faith holds that when people who have the awakened consciousness are in power, they won't screw everybody over. The only people who screw anybody over are the people who are caught by the ideology that they've woven. So you have these people who divided power, or divided labor, I should say, and appointed themselves masters that are doing the oppressing, and they created a mythology, an ideology, as Marx actually refers to it, sort of a religion that justifies why they get to be in power, and they oppress everybody else. Well, if you wake up everybody else, they're awake in the Marxist faith. Their goal is to become socialist man, which is new man, to be born again. And so they're born again as socialist man who understands the societal nature of mankind. And so their belief is that if you empower those people and you give those people total power, they won't reproduce the mistakes. Marx's if you read, he says it again and again and again and again throughout his writing, especially like a German ideology, that the communism represents the end of ideology. Ideology is the set of mythologies, the set of rationalizations that the people who have illegitimately claimed power over everybody. That set of rationalizations for their mythology for why they get to be in power. His goal is that he says that he doesn't believe communism is an ideology. He believes it is the end of all ideology. So the people who are the one set of people who have awakened to the poison of all ideology are now going to take power. So they're not going to have an ideology. They're not going to enforce an ideology. This is the central conceit of Marxism, is that the people who are awakened to his class consciousness don't have an ideology. And so, of course, that means they don't have a bunch of rationalizations and a mythology and a religion that justifies why they get to be in power. So when they're given power, they're the only people who could possibly wield power in the correct and pure way. And the end of that road, when they work out the various contradictions in practice, at first, whenever they take power, there's a transition period. People don't want to give up the old system. It might take 3 generations, they often say, to completely transition to a new way of thinking in a new society. By the way, 3 generations, 70 years or thereabouts is exactly how long it took the Soviet Union to completely collapse. So talk about getting that wrong. But the idea is that they have no ideology. And so they can't mismanage because they don't have an ideology. They are the ones who got rid of the mismanaging ideologies, and because they don't have one. And so how does that translate into race? They believe that they are the one true anti-racists. All the ideologies support racism in one form or another. They have the only anti-racist ideology. The primary way that the races, the primary ideology that the races put out is in the support of whiteness as a form of bourgeois property. They have white supremacy. The anti-racists are people who are intrinsically in belief that they have no racial ideology. They are anti-racist. They believe themselves to be ending racial ideology. And so if you put them in power and you give all of power to them, there will be a transition period where all the hidden racism in people, and they're going to have to deal with the problems, and they're going to get resentful, and they're going to be a backlash, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end, after long enough time, a few generations go by or so, they will actually realize that those people were supposed to be empowered and that they managed everything correctly and brought us to racial justice in the end. It is the central conceit in inversion is that they believe their ideology is to be the one not ideology. Everything else is an ideology. Everything but what they do is a mythology and a rationalization for maintaining power. So what they're saying is give the power, all of the power, to the only people who don't have an ideology, because that's how you miss. Ideology is the excuses people give to maintain and abuse power. We don't have that. So give us all the power, and therefore we can't possibly maintain or abuse it because we don't believe in that. And that's the central conceit. That's the central lie. That's the central. I mean, it's the most ridiculous. Anybody who's got their feet on the ground sees it's the most ridiculous thing in the entire universe. It's also the most self-serving thing in the entire universe, and it's also why it's always going to attract megalomaniacs like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, who are going to visit calamity on their people. And I guess we can add Trudeau to that list now in tremendous quantities. They're going to visit terrible things on other people. And then on the backside of it, what are they going to say? Well, that person actually had an ideology and hadn't achieved the pure level of communism, and that's why it didn't work out. And so real communism wasn't tried yet.
But even, half well-meaning people, if you want to put Sean Penn, Michael Moore, Noam Chomsky in that category, all cheered Hugo Chavez in 2000. Finally, this is the great democratic experiment. And today, while experiencing hyperinflation and promoting more printing and inflation under Biden, they're not sorry. They couldn't even care. So it's not like we're even engaged in this. Let's give you guys a shot to, quote, see if it works. The fact that it always works in theory is the reason that they're never going to concede that, well, this failed and we need to try something new. Is this behind? Is this why they are so explicitly racist in judging people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character? Because they've given themselves the sole monopoly license of non-racist. So now they feel to just judge everyone by their race, because the standards apply to everyone except them, the hopeful dictatorships of the, what would you call it, the anti-racist?
Yeah, I think that is, but I don't think they think that way. I think that they, of course, give themselves license to a degree because they believe themselves to be anti-racist. But the main thing is that their goal is to awaken racial consciousness. And the way you awaken racial consciousness is by making things racial, making every interaction, every relationship, every phenomenon, every institution to find its racialized components. And their justification they give themselves is, well, it's already racialized by the system, by the structural nature of the system. So we're not racializing, we're pointing out the racialization that's already there. And so that's their kind of get out of jail free card. So in a way, yes, that's why. But in another way, it's because their objective is to raise that consciousness, because it turns out that that's the playing field in which they contain the advantage and hold the power.
Thomas Sowell addresses a concept in a chapter called The Rise and Fall between 2007 and 2009. The incomes of people making $1 million or more fell by nearly 50%. The University of Michigan study found that among working Americans who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975, approximately 95% had risen out of that bracket by 1991, including 29% who had reached the top quintile by 1991, compared to only 5% who still remained in the bottom quintile. Even among the truly rich, there was turnover. When Forbes magazine ran its first list of the 400 richest Americans in 1982, that list included 14 Rockefellers, 28 DuPonts, and 11 Hunts. 20 years later, the list included 3 Rockefellers, 1 Hunt, and no DuPonts. Just over one-fifth of the people on the 1982 Forbes list of the wealthiest Americans inherited their wealth. By 2006, however, only 2% of the people on the list inherited their wealth. The IRS found that between 1996 and 2005, the income of individuals who had risen in the bottom 20% of income tax filers in 1996 had risen by 91% by 2005, and the income of those individuals who were in the top 1% in 1996 had fallen by 26%. Major myth that almost everyone believes. When it comes to race Marxism, what is the empirical evidence behind some of the big myths?
That's a question for somebody like Wilfred Riley, who's really good at empirical evidence with this. Not so much for me, who's mostly a theoretician, but I will point out that you're going to, I guarantee you that the data actually show kind of exactly the opposite of what the race Marxists are claiming. I don't know those data, but their analysis of reality is inverted. And so what the claim at the heart of this investigation that you just brought up from Thomas Sowell is identical in both kind of Marxists, is if you have a free market, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer because capital accumulates, and therefore it moves away from the people who have less of it and moves toward people who have more of it. The belief is the same, and this is kind of the heart of the critical race theory view of colorblindness, is that people who have social capital hoard it, and that they are able to build and make themselves more and more culturally relevant by cultural appropriation, by stealing the products, like whether it's tacos from Mexicans, whether it's blues turned into rock and roll from black musicians or whatever else, that they're going to steal those cultural products and incorporate them into whiteness and then exclude their original producers from that. And so the culturally rich will get richer and the culturally poor will get poorer. But I think, and I don't know what the empirical data are, and I don't even know exactly how to find this empirical data. I want to talk to Wilfred about that. He's really good. But what you find is actually a proliferation of, I would point actually, frankly, just to fusion foods, like a proliferation of shared stuff coming up with cool new ideas, right? And so when you have different people coming together and sharing ideas, like maybe if it's, I say fusion food because it's very simple, like certain flavors are going to go together really well and certain flavors aren't. Adding mole to a curry, like a coconut curry, is probably not going to be that good. And so what you can actually, but certain things when you mix them are going to be good. And so when you mix certain things, you're going to be able to figure out, oh, wow, if you put these two things together I never would have thought of before, we didn't have the ingredients or the capacity to do so before, that's going to be awesome. Like bringing, say, tomatoes back to Italy, which are a North American and South American crop, not a European crop. Italian food was tremendously enriched by the incorporation of tomatoes. Certain things are going to work and certain things aren't, and you have a broader base of experience to find out. And what you're also going to find is that people are sharing, if somebody comes along, let's say, it's a black-white thing or whatever, and they've got a cool guitar lick going on or whatever, you're going to have somebody who's going to hear it, who has a club or whatever, is going to come play in our club. This is exactly what you would have seen with like black comedians, black musicians. There's this kind of huge explosion following, from the 1970s, late 1970s in particular, going forward. But really it started earlier in the 1930s and 1940s with blues and R&B and all these kinds of different kinds of music were kind of exploding into the scene, and white people who had all the record deals and all the clubs were like, wow, that's actually, people want to listen to this. Like, people dance to this. People want to get together and hang out with this playing in the background. And what that does is starts bringing more people together. And so anywhere, so again, I don't know the specific data, anywhere you're bringing more people together with these kinds of things, you actually get the real benefits of diversity. Anywhere you start saying, no, this is our cultural product and that's your cultural product, and you cannot share them, you're going to limit the benefits of diversity. You're not going to create the so-called benefits of diversity, and you're not going to see innovation at the same level. So you're going to see stagnation, you're going to see loss, you're going to see division and damage and jealousy and envy, and all of the kind of social dysfunctions and material dysfunctions that follow from that. Whereas on the other hand, where you bring people together and it's like, yeah, play your thing. Oh, here's this cool thing I can do. This is this awesome food I came up with. Well, let's put some, cumin in that and see what happens. I think that'd be really good. And the next thing you know, you're coming up with new stuff that didn't exist before that people love, and it's bringing people together. Like, now you're bonding over food, you're bonding over music, you're bonding over putting up a building together, the community center together, you're bonding over playing a sport together, whatever it happens to be. And so again, the division, the conflict, the phrase Marx uses over and over again is class antagonism. To convince people that class antagonism is their reality is not going to produce this level of innovation. The level of innovation is always going to be higher where you're bringing people together irregardless of that, and for other purposes, and whether it's food, whether it's music, whether it's building, whether it's, sports, whatever it happens to be, actual community things, you're always going to end up with more innovation because there's more ideas in the space. So I don't know the data, but the idea that the culturally rich get richer and the culturally poor get poorer is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. The breaking of the color line by Jackie Robinson in baseball is a clear example. They brought Jackie Robinson for whatever set of quirky reasons about the guy, apparently mostly that he wouldn't throw a fit if he got called racial epithets. He'd keep his head down and play the game. Plus, he's extremely talented at baseball. They bring a black guy into baseball. The next, Major League Baseball's never been plagued like the other sports have been with various racial scandals. They bring a black guy into baseball. The next thing you know, you have more black people playing baseball. Then you have black people in the stands. Then you have black vendors selling things at the game. The whole thing just becomes expansionary. It doesn't collapse. And so you don't have the racially poor getting poorer. You get them in. I mean, it's funny that the meme is a baseball game that they always show with equity, people standing outside the fence at the backside. By incorporating more, actually everybody's getting elevated. This is what it boils down to ultimately, though, is positive sum, zero sum, and negative sum games. Some games are zero sum, but a lot of games are positive sum if you orient them correctly. You bring people together, and each person, in a sense, a positive sum game would be that each person comes in, brings in, puts in $1, and you get out $2.25 as a result, not $2. In a negative sum game would be each person comes in, they put in $1, and there's a cost, so you leave with $1.75 split between them or whatever, one form or another. Marxism, because it's based in class antagonism, is a negative sum game. And what it does is it masquerades itself as a positive sum game. It inverts that reality. It says that the only way to get a properly functioning super utopian society is by forcing everybody down onto the same level. You play a negative sum game and it will intrinsically become a positive sum outcome. That's a lie. That is a complete distortion. It's an inversion of reality. Whereas something like, whether it's cultural or whether it's material capitalism, as we call it, even though that's a Marxist term, where people are allowed to associate freely, et cetera, and bring together different ideas and different products. What you have there is that people come together and they innovate and they share. And new wheat is found, new chaff is excluded, and you actually have an elevation of everybody involved, or nearly everybody involved in the program. And so it's just the same distortion in a different context. So I guarantee you, because it's the same distortion, that the data will bear out exactly the same story if we find somebody who knows those data.
Scott Adams, a litmus test for people who claim to have such wide disagreements on something. His litmus test is, you name something that you believe that I don't believe. And the average person might say, I believe in helping the poor. And you say, well, I of course believe that. I don't believe in the state forcing you to. I think we should have a clean environment. Well, I do too. I just think competing organizations are a better way to achieve that than the state stifling innovation with regulation. So he says that is really how you can sort of come to this harmony of interest instead of this conflicting. So can you name some things that critical race theorists believe that you don't? And the average critical race theorist, not just someone like Delgado, the average person who may subscribe to this without even knowing what the term is. Can you name something they believe that you don't?
I can name a lot of things they believe that I don't believe. I mean, I don't believe, for example, that racism is necessarily perpetuating. I don't believe in structural determinism at all. As a matter of fact, I was thinking through it the other day, as if I ever got asked to a congressional hearing, and I had this kind of like whole little like weird vision in my head, or fantasy vision in my head of talking, and AOC comes after me or whatever, and I end up describing structural determinism and asking her point blank, do you believe in structural determinism? And then if she does, then she's a Marxist, and then she's exposed as such, and that's kind of the point of the little vision that I had going on. So I mean, I can name a lot of things that I believe in that they don't believe in. Colorblind equality. I believe that if we treat individuals as individuals, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, and we judge them on how they carry themselves, in other words, their character, and what they can accomplish, in other words, their merit, if we actually judge people that way, then we will actually create a hierarchy in society with the optimal amount of corruption, which means the lowest amount of corruption. And they believe, in fact, one of two things, either that's backwards, or depending on where they come from, either that's backwards, or that all hierarchy should be abolished. And in the long run, because they're Marxists, they believe that all hierarchy should be abolished. But this is another error, right? I think there should be, so there's something kind of the type you're looking for, I think. I believe that there should be as little corruption as possible. And they would say, I believe there should be as little corruption as possible, and the only way we can achieve that is by overthrowing the entire system and getting rid of the hierarchy entirely, because hierarchy is intrinsically corrupted, right? And I don't share that belief. I don't think that hierarchy is intrinsically corrupted. I think hierarchy is corrupted to the degree that it's not based on things like character and merit, competence, and getting results in reality. And so it kind of comes full circle to what we were talking about, because I think that we need to be putting the experiment first, not the theory first. And we put the experiment first and see what actually happens. Who is somebody? How do they carry themselves? What are their merits? What do they bring into the table? What can they do? What can they accomplish? And then that's how we're judging people. That's putting experiment first rather than putting theory first. Oh, we need people who have different structurally determined voices of color to speak up so that we understand the true nature of diversity, even though what that means is everybody speaking from the position of a cultural or of a critically conscious version of their own identity factors. In other words, everybody's a critical theorist. I think that when we put the experiment first, we're going to get better results. We're going to get outcomes and hierarchies that work. Same thing as I was talking about when you start blending cultures. What was it? I even phrased it in terms of an experience. Oh, let's mix cumin into that. Let's mix mole into that. Oh, that tastes like crap. Let's not serve that. But hey, when we put the lime in the coconut and shook it all out, that was really good. Let's serve that instead. Let's mix these things together and kind of go nuts. Oh, wow, this drink that's a traditional, whatever Thai drink or whatever, if you put freaking mezcal in that, which only existed in Mexico until like the last 40 years, that's really good. So now you have these fusion foods. That's actually you're putting the experiment first. Let's just mix stuff together and see what tastes good, and then we'll celebrate that together. Versus, well, no, if you mix these things, this is how it should be. Putting the theory first is the mistake. And so again, that's the key inversion for me. The key everything for me is that they want to put the theory first. I want to put the experiment first. I want to make sure that it works out right. We all agree, however, that we want, low corruption hierarchies. But I disagree in the fact that they don't know how to get them. They, in fact, make a high corruption hierarchy because it's based in putting theory first rather than the experiment first.
That's a great meme. Communism is about everyone being equal, and there's one giant statue of Chairman Mao. It's like, no, Bernie's going to be able to make executive orders. You will never make executive orders. You get punished for disobeying the executive orders. It's not going to be equality.
That's right.
Critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 public education. True or false? Why?
Yes, both. False mostly. So it's true and false. And this is a tiny kernel of truth. They are not teaching the legal theory qua legal theory. They're not coming into the classroom and saying critical race theory teaches that blah, 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 blah. However, what they're doing is they're taking the ideas of critical race theory, the practice of critical race theory. They're saying racial privilege exists. Racism is actually structural. They're teaching the contents of critical race theory. They're not teaching the theory. So you can see there's a little linguistic trick here. They're not teaching the theory itself, so they can say, I don't teach the theory. They're teaching the contents of the theory. It's the exact same as if you taught kids to pray and you fed them the sacraments and you did all this stuff and you said, I'm not teaching them religion in the schools. We're not teaching Catholicism in the schools. They're doing Catholicism in the school. They're dragging them through the prayers. They're dragging them through the rites. They're dragging them through the sacraments. But no one's ever sitting back and saying, well, Augustine said, and Pope Pius IX, and when we return to Aquinas, this is what Catholic doctrine, they're never teaching this is what Catholic doctrine says. They're just doing it. I actually had this when I was a kid. I had my first grade teacher wanted to get around the prohibition on prayer in schools or teaching Christianity in schools. And so she actually told us that the Lord's Prayer was the second verse of the Pledge of Allegiance and made us say both every day at the beginning of class, at the beginning of the school day. And it was literally exactly that. She was doing Christianity in the class she never taught us Christianity. And so the exact same little trick. So critical race theory is very present in the schools. They are not teaching specifically in a narrow technical sense critical race theory. They're teaching the tenets of critical race theory. They're teaching the ideas of critical race theory. They're teaching the mindset of critical race theory. They're teaching the class antagonism of critical race theory. They're not, however, teaching the theory as an academic theory. And this is a little trick they're playing to fool people.
Is one of the major solutions to get people to, stop being so attracted to things like critical race theory, to teach them maybe the division of labor and how, yes, there can be inequalities between me and a lot of actors, but thank God, because that's who people want to watch. I'm never going to sell as many books as Thomas Sowell or James Lindsay, and that's not a terrible thing. This inequality, because I'm not as good as them at what they do. No one's going to ever pay me to play basketball. LeBron James is going to be able to get $20 million a year. And that's not because he's oppressing me. It's because other people see different value and they believe in exchanging their money for doing something. Are there any general theories like the division of labor, like people have different preferences, like natural hierarchies? Peterson makes a great point where he says, anytime you want to do something, let's say, write a book on critical race theory, some people are better than others. Boom, you have a hierarchy. So for human beings to engage in action is to create a hierarchy because some people have different talents that are better than others. So when it comes to getting people to stop being so attracted, is it things like the teaching economic concepts of the division of labor? Any ideas on this front?
The division of labor combined with the law of comparative advantage really is a good starting place. I used to get kind of upset that we don't teach the law of comparative advantage pretty early on. It's a very simple law if you don't know what it says. If you're better at fishing and I'm better at gathering berries or whatever, then we enter a positive sum exchange. If you spend more of your time fishing instead of doing what you're bad at, which is gathering berries, and I spend more of my time gathering berries and less that I'm bad at, which is fishing, maybe we do a little on the sides. But if we're trying to maximize economic output, what we would do is you would spend all your time fishing, I'd spend all my time gathering berries, and we would exchange fish and berries based on some measurement of how difficult it is to obtain a fish versus how much difficult it is to obtain berries, and we could argue about what that works out to and create a method of equal exchange. So then you get the number of fish that you want and berries that you want, and I get the number of berries that I want and fish that I want. And it turns out that it's positive sum, because you're going to catch more fish than I would if I had to go get my own fish, and I'm going to get more berries than you would if you had to go get your berries. And so this is called the law of comparative advantage. I have a comparative advantage in berries, you have a comparative advantage in fish. That's the typical example given in the kind of economic textbooks. Is why it's fish and berries, I don't know, but it is. And so that's typically what you kind of see. And so what that means is, and the Christians are actually really good at this, they talk about things in terms of your gifts of your spirit. You actually, when you teach people that, you then can follow the lesson you follow it up with. So you got to find your thing. You got to find the thing you're good at, the thing that you can provide, the thing that you're bringing to the table that has value. And when you bring that thing to the table, and you bring you bring that value to the table, other people will want to participate in that value. The reason I sell a lot of books apparently is because people think I bring value to the table in the books that I write. And whatever anybody else does, maybe it's ranking podcasts like this, brings value to the table. So, this is the thing you do. And that's great. That's actually what it actually does is creates, and that's what people need to understand, is it creates the positive sum situation. If I had to spend all my time playing basketball, I'm terrible at basketball. I might get better at basketball, but I'm never going to be good enough to have I hate to put it this way so bluntly, but nobody watches the WNBA. They're great at basketball, relatively speaking, but it's not the same. Nobody watches it. Nobody cares. It's not exciting. And it's not because they're women. It's because men's sports are more vigorous and more, kind of high intensity and more action oriented. Nothing about technical skill or anything else. The women playing in the WNBA are excellent. Nobody wants to watch it. It's not that interesting. And so, because it's not the pinnacle stuff. So you enter into positive sum arrangements when you have people bringing maximum value, when it's based on merit and competence. In other words, the fruits of your labor, and actually judging what that's worth. Then you actually, as Peterson put it, you minimize corruption in the hierarchy. The hierarchy is going to be there, as he said, as soon as you are active. So I'd love to see people teaching about the law of comparative advantage and the idea of bringing value into the world. The ultimate dichotomy here between Marxism and this other view of the world, though, is they say that everybody's caught up in dependency, and they say the path out of dependency is solidarity. Everybody banding together to overthrow the system and install themselves in a position of power that won't cheat anybody in a fictional world they believe is possible. Whereas they explicitly tell people that taking responsibility causes you as an individual to be able to rise out of your bad situation, but it leaves everybody else behind. So you betrayed all the other people who didn't take responsibility, because they want everybody to be responsible to one another as men made for society, rather than people who take responsibility. When you teach comparative advantage, the law of comparative advantage and responsibility, what you'd be telling young people in particular is you need to find your thing, you need to get good at it, and you need to take responsibility for bringing it into the world in a way that, people can make use of. And when you take responsibility for yourself by finding your talent, honing your talent, and delivering your talent, then everybody benefits, everything gets better. And it's not a matter of sustainability, because a lot of it is, we're not all digging out rocks out of the ground or mining lithium out of the ground. It's not all about that. Whereas if, on the other hand, if you are chaining yourself down to the collective and you're not allowed to rise above them, you have to stay there, then you are actually, everybody's chaining themselves down. They're holding themselves down. A good model, metaphor would be like being on a ship, and the ship is sinking, and certain people can get up and try to swim to shore or get on a lifeboat or, break a chunk off and float on it. Or you could chain everybody. Nope. If we all don't get off together safely, then we all have to go down together. And that mentality is super not good, and super obviously not good when you put it in such stark terms. But that's the difference. How do you get out of dependency? Everybody all together through a revolution, or by teaching people to take responsibility, by leaning into what the Christians would call their gifts of spirit, by taking advantage of their natural talents to bring something of value to the world, to identify your talents, hone your talents, and deliver your talents in a way that provides value to other people, that they're then willing to exchange whatever value they're producing in one mechanism or another, currency being a symbolic mechanism of exchange of value. But what has to happen is everybody has to be producing their value. And so taking that individual responsibility, again, works out better. You're not chained down to anybody. And so I think teaching that would be a great thing.
excellent contributions there. Yeah, I'm never going to have a voice as good as Adele. That's a good thing. I'll never be as funny as Jerry Seinfeld, thank God, because that's who people want to watch. The highest paid models on the planet, it's like all of them are women. Like the top 50 are all women. And there's nothing terrible about that. So no need to get too upset. My final question to you is, you have 90 seconds to talk to the DNC in 2022. What is your message going to be to them? Think of your answer while I read my favorite Karl Marx quote. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? 90 seconds to talk to the DNC. What do you say?
We see you. We see you, DNC. We know what you're doing. We see through you. It's not going to work this time. You think that it's hidden. It's not hidden. You need to hang it up. Those among you that are still, the DNC is made up of individuals. We see that too. Those of you who are individuals you need to stop and you need to reflect. I know you're the Democratic Party, but we are a republic. You need to step back from the ledge. We're not going into communism, and you need to start putting the Constitution first. Your oath in office is, if you take office, is to the Constitution, and you need to start taking that oath seriously. And if you don't, we see you. We know what you're doing. We know that you're tyrants, or budding tyrants, or supporting tyranny. And we will push you out of office by every legal means. We will remove your hands from the levers of power by every legal means. And if, to the degree that it's in our power, you will never hold any power, never hold any opportunity, and never bring any of the probably good motivations that you have for doing what you're doing to fruit in this country ever again. And a lot of you are going to go to prison. So back off the ledge, support the Constitution. Constitutionalists, Democratic or Republican, doesn't matter. Left or right, doesn't matter. If you're constitutionalist, you've got the American project, right? If you don't, you're part of the problem, and you have been unmasked. We see you, and we will remove you from power.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Dr. Lindsay, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Keith.